After the colossal success that was the Arkham quadrilogy, we were left in a deafening silence following a controversial and explosive swansong. The character of Batman was done proper justice, and his story felt complete. Regardless of your thoughts on some of the villains or certain creative decisions, it was clear that topping the Arkham franchise and this interpretation of the character would be a near impossible task. So imagine the reaction when Warner Brothers decided to not even try, instead focusing on the legacy and apprentices the Knight left behind. This is the basis of Gotham Knights, and I believe it's a good foundation to build a story and a new generation of heroes. While separate from the Arkham timeline, Gotham Knights respects its predecessor by building off of some major themes left behind in Arkham, like the Joker and Bruce. Bruce in this story is dead, and it's left to his sidekicks Nightwing, Red Hood, Robin, and Batgirl to pick up their socks and become Gotham's criminals' new reason to think twice. But these new Knights struggle, not in their skills or access to technology, but in reputation. They aren't feared like their mentor, and are seen as lesser than them, so the team has goals of establishing their reputation and fear, but also filling the boots of their dead father figure. This is a perfect means of expanding the Batman universe without retreading the steps of the Arkham series, and it parallels the Knights living up to Batman's legacy, and the game living up to the Arkham legacy. Unfortunately, while Batgirl, Red Hood, Robin, and Nightwing come into their own by the end of the story, Gotham Knights seems stuck in year one. A shoddy launch with bugs and performance issues around every corner, and the game itself being a grind for the first few hours, means Gotham Knights puts its worst foot forward and trips on that first step. For every excellent set piece is a sub 20 frame drop. Every satisfying combo is soured by a visual bug or a dropped input. These issues do not ruin the experience, and if these kinks are ironed out, Gotham Knights would be a worthy successor to the Arkham legacy. But still, Gotham Knights is severely misunderstood. Look at any review and it becomes clear that Gotham Knights was a critical failure. Much like my dietary efforts. Between you and me, I'm lazy, and having to drag myself to the grocery store to grab ingredients, plan out my recipe, all to then get halfway into the recipe and realize I forgot the eggplants, sucks. Fortunately, that's not a problem when I order my meals from HelloFresh. You won't need to worry about portions, complex recipes, grocery stores not having what you need, and coming up with what to cook ever again. HelloFresh delivers recipes and meals right to your door, and they have options for any dietary restrictions so people like me who can't have dairy and gluten can still have delicious meals, and ones that don't cost an arm and a leg. I'm looking forward to whipping up this Mediterranean-style chicken, but of course, I'll be holding the feta. If you want to get up to 20 free meals with your purchase, you can click the link in the description or use code HelloBoyAqua at the checkout. That's HelloBoyAqua at the checkout, or just use the link in the description and the pinned comment. Enjoy the free meals, and thank you HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. I should also make it clear my perspective, because I'd be lying if I said this would be a perfectly objective review. So rather than put on a facade that I'm smarter than you, I'll let you know where my biases stand and you can hear my thoughts with that in mind. The first is that while I consider myself a relatively casual fan of Batman, I'm a die-hard Arkham fan. I love everything about the games and I think they're all near perfect. Except Arkham Origins Blackgate. That game hurt me. Jokes aside, I'm head over heels for the Arkham series, but I want this game to, much like its characters, develop its own identity separate from Arkham. After my time with Gotham Knights, I can confidently say that if the issues outlined in this video are addressed, I would believe this is an excellent game worth your money. The idea is solid and the foundation is there, but there are a handful of minor blemishes that add up to create an ugly image. Discussion surrounding this game has been extreme at best. Most reviews and videos have blatantly misrepresented parts of the game and have exaggerated others. Many claim it's a disgrace or that it's awful, but I don't believe that at all. In fact, many of the issues that some have are not as bad as the first 3 hours would have you believe. The RPG mechanics, gear stats, and skill trees are here, but they are balanced well. A casual can get away with just about anything, opting for form over function, but those who enjoy min-maxing their stats can get a lot of mileage here. But we can't ignore the elephant-sized bat in the room. While comparisons to the Arkham series are unfair, as this game is clearly not trying to be an Arkham game, we can't ignore its place as the gold standard for superhero games. The Arkham games are the blueprint for what to do in a superhero game, and while I am looking at Gotham Knights as its own product, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't times where I thought, why is this mechanic executed in this way when previous Batman games perfected it? Things like movement in the Arkham games have felt fluid since City, and yet the gliding here feels comparable to Asylum. It's not that I want an Arkham game. I've made it clear in prior videos that I think the Arkham game should stay contained and untouched, lest their legacy be ruined. So let's analyze why this game failed, and how it can and is being saved, all while in the shadow of its predecessor. Before we get into anything, I need to address the visual bugs and frame issues you'll be seeing throughout this video. I played the game on release, spent my own hard-earned Canadian dollars for it, and began recording after the first patch of November. I waited because the game ran quite poorly on launch, and I'd hoped the first patch might make this game run better, and therefore make my video look better, but the opposite had occurred. The November patch actually made the game run worse somehow, but I understand that there's still time for issues to be fixed. In fact, in the weeks it's taken to write the script, a number of updates have released that marginally improve performance. So with that in mind, I will have a pinned comment that will have updates regarding how the game runs. I will also post corrections or updates to patched issues. So if you see an issue in this video that isn't in the game anymore, chances are the devs have patched it. I also recorded all my footage on an external capture device, meaning that recording the game did not impact performance at all. I don't typically give this caveat, but it is necessary here because in writing this video, there have been a number of patches that have solved problems I had, and the performance, while still rocky, is improving with each update. It doesn't excuse the state of the game at launch, but it is clear that the developers are trying to do something about it. Finally, any issues with this game is not to be directed at any individual developer. The quality of this game should not be used to justify any harassment towards the people that poured their blood, sweat, and tears into this product. So, let's begin by looking at the presentation, as it's the biggest turnoff right now. Plainly, it just seems like the game is poorly optimized. I played this on PC with hopes that 60 frames was an option, and to be fair, there were many points where the game hit it for minutes at a time. But something isn't working right here when other games that have greater fidelity are running smoother. Most frame drops will be taking place when traversing Gotham City, and the city itself is surprisingly beautiful. It may not be the most technically impressive, I assume to account for the co-op that permeates throughout almost the entirety of the game, but Gotham is a neon skyline hemmed by the Gothic architecture. Buildings are close enough to make traversing the rooftops possible, but there are plenty of wide streets and long bridges to warrant the use of the bat cycle or airborne movement. Streets are as filthy as the criminals that occupy it, and the city feels alive with people commenting on your appearance, both polite and rude. And little details like the police showing up to a crime after you've stopped it go a long way in making this Gotham the most vibrant we've seen, and one of the few to not have its citizens evacuated. During the many showdowns, we'll see parts of Gotham change, and it's against the likes of Freeze that we see how bad but beautiful things can become, as the concrete towers are coated in ice and we blaze through the streets against the snow. I wish we saw more of this artistic variety in Gotham, because the moments like this, or when the sky is blood red later in the story, communicate raised stakes without some character telling you that things are bad. The only inhibitor to your enjoyment of the city is the frame rate, but that is less prevalent inside, and no sacrifice to the level of detail. Interiors continue the Gothic aesthetic, and due to being enclosed, it offers greater detail and a more stable experience. I appreciate that much like the exteriors, the insides feel more lively, and aren't the anarchy and litter-ridden streets we had seen in previous games. Taking down guards in a wealthy penthouse was something previous games didn't offer much of, and this game even revisits some familiar locations but puts new spins on them. The Arkham Asylum we see in this game abandons the contortions of iron and Victorian architecture from the previous visits and leans into the haunted undertones of the location. When in its depths, we can find the offices of famous characters, radios that won't turn off, and other rather spooky occurrences that make this stay enjoyable, if not better than the Mastercraft Rocksteady presented us with. The place is abandoned, so it looks a bit trash, but doesn't compare to the locations Harley Quinn occupies, which are splattered with spray paint and mayhem. While we're on the topic of Harley, we can discuss my favorite part of this game, but I want to apologize first. I've made many jokes about how down astronomical I am for Harley and others in these Batman games, and I've realized that objectifying women for the sake of a joke is not okay. But men are still on the table. Have you guys seen the Pixar mom level dump truck on Nightwing? Oh my god! Forget a snack, this dude is fine dining. And never before have I felt such an urge for crime than I do now, because if it means I get choked out by those thighs, I will take my chances. Okay, enough jokes. Let's continue with the solid level design, which features both secretive tombs, home to the court, and the Blackgate prison, which you'll visit a few times across the game. And it always looks great. When first approaching, the high concrete walls restrict the night sky above, and they feel oppressive, like you yourself are being caged within. When you enter the prison itself, you'll be chasing down a clue from Harley. You'll then end up in the yard while a bubbly punk song plays. It wasn't my cup of tea music-wise, but it added some great flair to the set piece, and I wish there was more of this in the game. The rest of the soundtrack is mostly forgettable, but never enters bad territory. The theme that plays when roaming the city is great, but my absolute favorite is the bangers they play during the races. These things go way too hard and are easily the best songs in the game, making traversal feel far more visceral than it actually is. What's most unfortunate about Gotham Knights is that if it weren't for the performance issues, I'd say this is a great looking game. Many have compared this game to its predecessor of many years, Arkham Knight, and while I can agree that Arkham Knight is significantly better looking, it didn't have consistent tether-free co-op, so I find it hard to compare. And we should also remember that Arkham Knight had its fair share of optimization issues on release too. Even with the comparisons, the game looks solid, and the animations for different characters and their takedowns that are unique to them are slick. Its rendition of Gotham is beautiful, and yet it feels like it is constantly bogged down by glitches and a lack of engaging ways to explore such a good-looking city. The gameplay of Gotham Knights is one that gets good, but it takes a few hours to get there, leaving most players with the impression that it has little to offer. Traversal is one of the most disappointing facets of gameplay, and disappointing not only for its lack of depth, but in its thick coat of untapped potential. The easiest place to see this is when gliding as Batgirl. This is one of those parts of the game where comparisons are near impossible to avoid because gliding was perfected over a decade prior. The one special ingredient that elevates gliding from good to great is a sense of momentum. You have the ability to turn and steer both vertically and horizontally, and even the ability to nosedive, but there is barely any sense of speed and momentum. Your speed is capped out so early on, so any momentum that is transferred from a nosedive is lost within a second or two. The gliding also feels wonky to control. I find it difficult to excuse this because, as said, this has been perfected time and time again, and it should have been perfected here. Gotham Knights provides such an amazing city for us to explore, but time and time again they make getting around and subsequently exploring said world tedious and boring. Gliding is the most in-depth means of traversal and certainly requires the most skill, even if the skill floor and ceiling begin and end at the Earth's core. The rest of the Bat family don't fare well, with Red Hood in particular having an unconventional means of travel. He uses the powers granted to him from the Lazarus Pit to jump large distances in the air, but I've enjoyed imagining that it's just him propelling himself using Wario-esque farts. It's just a matter of holding R2 and there's a little control here, but not much else. It fortunately looks good, but the visuals age quickly. It at least pairs with the grappling hook well, in that short and long distances can be crossed with a few air hops, adding variation to rooftop traversal. At least Robin has a more interesting foundation than jumping, with his slideways which sees him teleporting short distances. This is as simple as hitting R2 and moving anywhere you want to go. It's the most precise of the abilities, but as you can likely tell by the footage, it isn't very engaging. You have a time limit of 8 seconds before you're forced out of the teleport, but you can re-enter the sideways right away, so the restriction feels redundant. This is one of the weaker traversal options for the player, but for other players it is one of the best, as a spectator cannot see where Robin is when he's mid-teleport, so he just blips from place to place. Finally, we have Nightwing's Trapeze, which is essentially a Fortnite glider, no battle pass required. It's as simple as holding R2 and pushing where you want to go. It's efficient enough and there's a ton of fun to be had when bobbing and weaving in between buildings. My biggest gripe with this mode of traversal, and this applies to all of them, is that there's a general lack of speed and response from all modes. I understand that speed was most likely capped to prevent players moving too fast and not giving the game enough time to load things in, but when these abilities lack speed, they offer fewer advantages to grappling. Every hero can use their grapnel gun to pull themselves to a point, and even transfer their momentum into a jump. This is a fine enough way of traversing and has a surprising amount of freedom as you can cancel it midway, but many will desire something more, if not for speed then for variety and freedom. When mixed into the Knighthood abilities, it's quite good, but if you want a more grounded means of getting around, you'll have the Bat Cycle. When I said that Gotham Knights puts its worst foot forward, this was one of the things I had in mind. I don't think the Bat Cycle is a bad idea, but when one of, if not the largest gripe from the last Batman game was the overuse of a vehicle, I think introducing another vehicle within the first 15 minutes is just calling back to an unpleasant memory for a lot of people. When riding, it's fine. The bike moves at a slow speed, and the white speed lines that edge the screen feel cheap because of this. In a vacuum, riding down the streets, cape flapping in the wind is good, but when you're moving to a waypoint or participating in a race, you start to see that your actual speed is low. Velocity aside, the drifting is nice, and so is the jump eject. I also enjoy the way it appears from cloaking. It's unrealistic, but it's far too convenient to complain about. While we're on the topic of the game leading with its worst assets, we can talk about how you unlock most of the traversal abilities. The Knighthood traversal is unlocked through completing some challenges that are the same for each character. Defeat 3 mini-bosses, stop 10 premeditated crimes, and complete the time strike training. This will take you anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours, and is necessary for every character if you want some of their best abilities, and if you want some variation in your traversal. This means that early on, you'll be forced to grind and the reward is less than stellar. Odds are you'll try to complete these challenges early and in the open world, which exposes 2 other issues with early gameplay. The first is that every character starts at the same base point. By the time each character hits level 10, they'll be distinct enough from one another, but in those first hours, the only difference is speed, which isn't drastic enough from character to character to make an impact. Issues begin even before you get to the open world grind, as the tutorial sees you engaging in the gear system that, while I like in this game, is something many don't want to see in a game, as it immediately brings to mind the disaster of Marvel's Avengers. In the opening objective, investigating Kirk Langstrom's lab, we run into one of the many factions of Gotham City. There's a good variety here, but for some odd reason we are introduced to the Freaks. I don't mind goons being idiots, and it makes it more fun to listen to, but this faction has the worst dialogue out of the entire cast. I understand that they are freaks, they are insane, and typically insane people don't string together coherent sentences, but some of these lines, which will be some of the worst you hear, are right at the start.
Hey, look up here! I'm a professor of setting stuff on fire!
Other factions here are fine dialogue-wise, and all of this is without mentioning the biggest issue people took from the moment this game was revealed, which is the health bar. If you're out of the loop, I sound insane, but typically, gamers will see a health bar and damage numbers and shriek in fear because it usually is indicative of RPG mechanics that are often handled poorly. I don't think it's handled poorly here, but it still has room to improve. The greater issue is Gotham Knights has to deal with the fact that based on one simple decision to include these health bars, many players will make assumptions about the rest of the game, and compounding this on top of everything else, you see why many refunded the game or played the first few hours and never went back. The truth is, Gotham Knights gets significantly better as you progress, but I can't blame someone for not wanting to push past that initial barrier. One of the first reasons the post-early grind is great is because I don't have to grind it all past that. I played on normal difficulty and I found that I often had to complete maybe 1 or 2 side tangents, not missions, to get the gear I needed. Many of the story missions reward you with gear that scales to your level and is of a high rarity, meaning if you are like me, then you can beeline the story. Once you finish the game, there is a slight endgame grind, but not a very rewarding one. By the time all side quests have been completed, you'll have maxed out characters ready for New Game Plus, which offers a harder challenge and a new level cap. Unlocking skills does not change the way you traverse the city, but it heavily impacts combat and stealth, and offers a proper reason to play as every character. Nightwing is the acrobatic leader of the group, and I have a few issues with him being portrayed as the head of the pack, but gripes about leadership aside, his tree focuses on assisting allies and bouncing from enemy to enemy. His attacks are flashy, dodges consecutive and fluid, but struggles at range. Most of his attacks are boosted when in the air, and his buffs apply to his team too, making him great in co-op. Nightwing's abilities consist of dealing elemental damage, some single target focus, and a bounce that shoots him into the air, allowing him to bounce off of enemies a handful of times. I felt that Nightwing was often floaty, but his pinball-like nature of bouncing from one enemy to another was unique. The game also attempts to give Nightwing a skill tree dedicated to boosting allies, but I found this tree unhelpful as it requires another person to play with, and you'd be surprised how hard it is to convince someone to buy this game, especially after its initial reception. I also find the buffs didn't do much when you only have one other player in your game. I can imagine this character would see more play if the multiplayer extended to 4 players, which in the case of the Heroic Assault update is true. Having Nightwing who can buff everyone in the party when taking down enemies is a near necessity, and using any other build with him just feels like a waste. Nightwing can be built out for solo play too, which is appreciated, but his ability to enable allies will always outshine his individual capabilities. Robin is the group's stealth expert, and he makes any sneaking an absolute cakewalk. Everything in his kit is built around getting in and out of sight quickly, which plays to his stature of being the most nimble and young of the group. He boasts the ability to enter stealth again quickly after a pounce attack and can take down brutes in stealth, unique to his skill set. His bow staff is fine enough for crowd control, but he ultimately struggles in combat compared to his brothers and sister, which makes playing him a fun trade-off. His momentum abilities cover nearly every base, as do all of them, and he moves with some speed but not much power. Red Hood is the brute of the bunch and utilizes his non-lethal pistols to deal damage from a distance. He excels in open combat and keeping the entire field stun-locked behind bullets and punches that hit like a truck. Stealth never works too well, but your proper aim rewards an insane amount of damage assuming you are sharp enough. Most of his heavy attacks knock enemies flat on their ass, making Jason perfect for patrols as he barely breaks a sweat with the average goon. Finally, there is who I find to be the best character, Batgirl. Her focus is on hacking and one-on-one combat. The hacking makes most stealth segments significantly easier and more diverse, allowing her to attract enemies to particular locations and even disable cameras and other traps temporarily. With her toolkit, plenty of encounters can be outright skipped, but if you're spotted, you'll find that she's an animal in combat because of one momentum ability, the beatdown. Taking a note from Bruce's hijinks in the Arkham series, the beatdown sees her launching a knee at the enemy and going to town, melting whatever health bar is in her way. What makes the ability even better is that critical strikes are more common, I think, and multiple upgrades allow her to charge a momentum bar faster and not be stunned out of a beatdown. The only weakness is that this attack does not work on most enemies larger than her, but an alternate ability covers that. Any boss fight against an average size foe will be an absolute cakewalk, and I genuinely think that Barbara is a bit broken in this sense. Perhaps it's just her excelling in a particular field, but even crowd control is a breeze, and as mentioned, hacking makes stealth a breeze too. She's easily the most well-rounded character in the game, and I wouldn't blame the average player for sticking with her throughout the entirety of it. Everyone has a proper ability and specialty that makes them fit for specific situations, but outside of that specialty, they have a wide selection of tools to cover any weak points, meaning that in every situation, the player can get by, and without suffering too many consequences. I'm torn on my thoughts here because I would have liked characters with more variety and weaknesses to encourage co-op, but I also would feel heavily restricted if characters were so specialized that doing anything outside of their strength was useless. Overall, I still find the combat fun, and there was still plenty of reasons to use the other characters, and it helps keep a New Game Plus run more varied. Red Hood's pistols ask for a ranged playstyle compared to Batgirl, who opts to get in the enemy's face. In co-op, it's a lot of fun, and endgame grinds with each hero are enjoyable, but what does that grind look like? Gotham Knights has a patrol system in which there are different crimes taking place all around Gotham, but you don't know about it yet. You first have to gather evidence, discover the crime, and then stop it before it takes place or during. As you finish the premeditated crimes, you'll find yourself discovering uncovering more, as each defeated enemy drops more evidence, creating a snowball of crimes to stop. It creates an enjoyable gameplay loop, and it all starts with the petty crime. You have to scan different enemies to find out which one has your information, but it's always the goon who's 1 or 2 levels above the others. Once you grab them, you can interrogate them, and it fulfills an admittedly childlike fantasy of dropping in, beating the living hell out of everyone, putting someone in a chokehold, and leaving within 20 seconds. Once you run out of crimes, you return to the Belfry, your home base, and it's there that you can change characters, gear, and exit again to start the next night. The end of each night presents some statistics about how many crimes were stopped, damage you dealt, and more. I feel like plenty of superhero games focus on the big bad enemies, the major threats to the city, and while those are fun, I can appreciate Gotham Knights showing love to the small-time crime fighting. And it acts as a reminder that while Batman is dealing with the foes seeking world domination, he's still keeping tabs on the grassroots crime. These crimes are seamless too. Entering a robbed bank puts no loading screens in front of you, and entrances range from vents and windows to the front door. The premeditated crimes are enjoyable enough. They are different excuses to defeat a number of enemies that are either performing data transfers, trying to kidnap someone, holding important information, but the variety in objectives and locations keep these fun for the runtime. Having one objective asks that you take down a group of thugs that are holding hard drives means you can go in whatever way you like, but another may see some thugs holding hostages with bombs to them, and if you're spotted, they'll detonate said bombs. This offers a unique stealth challenge that, if failed, which trust me, you will fail them on harder difficulties, does not result in a game over, or even death all the time. The hostages just die, and your character has to leave. It helps the world feel real and not revolve around the player. I understand that this is just a product of the game's co-op needing to be accounted for, but I still appreciate it. The hostages further exemplify how different characters approach a challenge. There are cameras that can spot you, which must be disabled first, but with an upgrade for Barbara, she'll cloak herself, preventing detection from cameras, mines, or any other technology. Eventually, you will begin discovering dens which act as the bases of criminals, and they are as varied as the others but offer likely the greatest challenge. There then comes a point where you transition from the mid-game to the endgame, and it's at this point that Gotham Knights gameplay loop shifts entirely, but we'll leave that to its own section as it turns side quests that are done initially out of fun and distraction to ones completed for a grind. But why do you grind? And for what? Well, this is one of the largest issues people immediately noticed. You grind for gear, experience, and materials. Experience is handled well here, as I always felt I was leveling up and unlocking something new consistently. The best part about progression is that when you rank up with one character, it applies to all of them. This is such a simple change but goes a long way for allowing the player to switch things up whenever, and it prevents the player from feeling restricted to one character because they would have to grind to catch up on the others. The only thing holding you back then is the gear, but the game even has that covered, as after each story mission, every character is given a piece of heroic gear. Crafted gear does not carry over, but that can be solved through stopping a few crimes. By the end, the time between level ups is higher, but by then you aren't grinding for endgame levels, instead for endgame gear. The gear system here is actually good. I appreciate that for those looking to ignore the gear like I was, you can get through the game with almost no issues by just using whatever gear is of the highest level and whatever has the bigger power number. It is only by the endgame that certain gear will outperform ones that have a higher power level, and rather drastically too. I'd have a legendary piece of gear that, despite being of a lower level than one of a higher level, would work better for a character. I can understand this being an issue for some, but I have to admit that in my playthrough, by the time gear started actually mattering beyond power level, I was already tinkering with different mods and builds and looking into the specifics of each piece of gear. The different gear has numerous buffs, sometimes ranging from extra elemental buildup to critical hit damage to critical chance, and each piece has room for a few mods, which is where you can really start tailoring your character. Red Hood's pistols are great for ranged criticals, and after speccing into abilities that up his critical rate and critical damage, I had a nigh unstoppable character as he riddled his enemies, every other hit being a critical, and even mini-bosses going down in a flash. And dodging a punch is a hell of a lot easier when they can't even get close enough to swing. I liked having different sets with different elemental resistances, so when tackling a villain like Freeze, I could have a suit that resisted cold, something we see Batman do all the time. It also helps that experimenting offers a range of aesthetics, and they all look stellar, aside from the Shinobi style, not my favorite, but the point is, when every style looks as good as this, I have more fun experimenting. Once a suit is equipped, you'll have a few options for colors, variations to things like symbols, gauntlets, boots, and masks, helping to keep your character unique to you. But how do you obtain these suits and mods? Crafting. The final piece of our unholy trinity. Throughout the game, by completing tasks and opening chests, you'll find resources and materials that can be used to craft gear, the blueprints of which you find in the same way. I can't say I'm a big fan of keeping track of a handful of different materials, but I also can't say I ever had to. For context, I crafted a lot of gear and did quite a few side quests. Not until crafting endgame gear, had insufficient materials. I just didn't think about it, and when I was short, I was quickly able to find a side quest that rewarded the specific material I was looking for. Any old gear can be dismantled for materials, and overall the crafting system just feels useless. If I never have to worry about resources and I run around collecting blueprints to craft, why not just give me the gear outright? Otherwise, there is a frustration in that when you do get a new blueprint, you have to wait until you get to the Belfry to equip it. It makes the acquisition of new gear tedious because I could get a new armor set that I love, but I have to either end my patrol early, which will remove all premeditated crimes from the map, or I wait until the end of the night, and by then, I've likely leveled up or have found better gear that renders the previous useless. It makes progression come in bursts, and if we could just equip the gear we find right away, we could be constantly progressing and changing our looks, making the, at times, repetitive gameplay slightly less so. But why are players not happy about these systems? They don't seem to be as bad as other systems like Avengers. I think the issue is that these mechanics seem a lot more intrusive on the surface, and they indicate a larger Pavlovian response in players. People see gear systems and immediately think of Avengers, which had individual threads you could equip that made it feel like they had no impact. But here, the equipment is kept minimalistic and offers an actual reason to use it. This system strikes a solid balance between pleasing casual players who will pick whatever is most aesthetically pleasing, while also satisfying people like myself who enjoy optimizing a build. My only wish is that the transmogs could be customizable. The transmogs are skins that go on top of your current gear. The issue is that you can't customize the appearance of the transmog, which to me sort of defeats the purpose. I love the way the Beyond suits look, but when it is restricted to a certain color scheme, I don't like it as much. A solution is just to find gear with the style you want, but especially by the endgame, it'll take a while to find gear that meets your aesthetic requirements while also having viable stats. One of the best parts of any superhero game is getting to use the different outfits and styles, and this game has plenty to offer, but accessing them could be a bit less tedious. I genuinely don't believe the gear system is bad at all, and there is a good chance that people claiming it makes no impact on the game have either played on an easier difficulty for reasons which we will get into, or they looked purely at the damage the gear does and not how stats like elemental buildup and crit chance can be kitted out to fit certain builds, which would make a world of a difference. Speccing into elemental effect for Red Hood worked fine, offering 700 to 900 damage, but when speccing into critical hits, I was dealing up to 35,000 damage with each crit. The mods can be merged to create greater versions, but I found this to be tedious and I can't blame someone for not engaging fully with the mods. It is, however, the same story, as mods that increase elemental buildup, crit chance, or just plain damage will be helpful in creating those endgame or even mid-game builds. I've spoken a lot about abilities, gear, but not enough about the combat itself. I haven't talked about it up to now because generally people don't have an issue with it. It isn't critically acclaimed, but many feel it's serviceable, and I agree. Its foundations are light attacks, heavy attacks, and dodging. Dodging is in place of countering, but if you dodge with proper timing, then you'll return a counterattack that knocks the enemy on the ground. Once on the ground or at low health, an enemy can be grabbed. From there, you can throw or strike them, and that's about everything that combat builds off of. One of the first criticisms I had seen regarding the combat is, and this was levied against the Arkham games too, was that it was button mashy. As I'm sure you can imagine, the rebuttal is the same here. Time strikes are a mechanic where if you hit the attack button just before an attack hits, you'll do a time strike, offering more damage and a flashier animation. But this is not simply a rhythmic press, but one that is intentional. Different animations means that pressing the attack button at the right time is constantly changing, which makes a combo of time strikes difficult, but also rewarding as hell when you pull it off. This does not prevent the combat from being a mash of square for the entire playthrough, but it does heavily encourage you to play with a delicate touch for not only more styles, but more damage too. The enemies on offer are slim at first, but by the midway point the roster is acceptable. There are a few classes that extend across every faction in the game, those being the Brawlers focusing on hand-to-hand, the Rangers using guns, the Area of Effect using Molotovs and grenades, and the Brutes, who are a mix of the three with some extra thickness. The Brutes have heavier attacks and defenses that must be broken with your heavy attack. Otherwise, they have a large health bar and that's about it. The Brutes also can't be taken out in stealth unless you play as Robin. They have variations from freaks to regulators, but they all function the same, barring the added elemental damage. If hit with enough fire or poison, you'll take sustained damage, but if hit with enough freeze, you'll be frozen for a few seconds. The mob and the freaks are quite basic, but the regulators have a new enemy called the Drone Master that can deploy 2 drones. One that will shoot you from afar, and another that will detonate in front of you. These guys have a larger health bar and are more of a pain in the ass than anything. The regulators also have snipers that are the same as ranged enemies, but with a slow windup and devastating damage. The only real deviation is with the Court of Owls and the League of Shadows. The Court begins introducing specialists that are like the Brawlers but can block your attacks, meaning you'll need heavy attacks to begin a combo. At higher levels and difficulties, enemies across the board will start doing this, and that includes dodging projectiles. The Talons that are introduced about halfway through the game will move erratically and dodge all of your attacks unless first stunned with a heavy ranged attack. From there, a grab strike will put them down or a few good hits. These enemies were beyond annoying because the heavy ranged attack would sometimes stun them and other times it wouldn't. Perhaps it's the game not explaining how to deal with them properly, but they always elicited a sigh when they showed up. The Brutes introduced are fine enough, but they share an ability with other high-ranking owls in that when at low health, they'll regain all of their health. meaning you have to defeat them twice. There is one caveat in that if you defeat them before they power up or grab them out of it, you can stop them, which is nice, but in a crowd setting, this is not always possible. By the late game, they won't be interruptible at all too, which means you are defeating the same enemy twice. This also impacts stealth, as when you take down an enemy, they'll just get back up and become hostile. This enemy type or ability can be removed from the game entirely, and Gotham Knights would be so much better for it. The final faction with a major difference is the League. The League makes use of smoke screens and pseudo-teleportation to get the drop on you, but go down the same way. I appreciated that despite their attacks coming out of literally nowhere, they're telegraphed well, so with proper attention I could dodge. These enemies are best dealt with through damage over time, meaning elemental builds will thrive. The brutes now carry guns, and some of the combos the ninjas can perform are downright brutal. The combat in general flows well enough, though there were some issues with enemies lunging unrealistic distances to land a hit. I also noticed that there were combos that felt near impossible to dodge, or the times when dodging still resulted in getting hit, but these are minor. Most encounters are similar regardless of faction, but they act as a canvas for you to express your fighting style, which works in the game's favor. When specific enemies like Talons or the League are introduced, they force you to change the choreography and how you move from enemy to enemy. The animations look good, and especially the final takedowns have an extra punch, but before an encounter begins, there's a good chance you'll be thinning the numbers in stealth. Stealth is as basic as it gets here, with again every character's strengths impacting the way you approach it. You have a silent takedown, which can be initiated above, below, and behind an enemy, and a loud ambush takedown for when you want to make a dramatic entrance. Enemies take a forgiving amount of time to spot you, and certain enemies like the brutes can't be taken down, so playing around them is an added layer of challenge. Explosive barrels surround most encounters, meaning you can reliably chip away at the enemies from above. With Barbara, you can make use of some hacks to lure enemies and even shroud yourself from cameras and mines. Robin can plant mines that'll lure enemies to a location where they'll be hit, and he can perform a vantage takedown, simultaneously dropping a mine to lure other goons closer, and Nightwing and Red Hood don't have much to offer, but at least Jason can one-shot most goons with his pistol before heading in. The AI is forgiving, at times too much, and if spotted, the enemy will be so scared that they fall back and don't even scream for a few seconds, giving ample time to finish them off before you're caught. This feature is especially appreciated given that you can't reload a checkpoint as often. Enemies will also investigate sounds and bodies, and when investigating, they'll move erratically, which kept me on my toes. When an enemy is talking and you take them down, cutting off their dialogue, others will wonder what happened and move to investigate. The issue with stealth is that I just described everything it has to offer. In gameplay, it works, but the way you interact with enemies does not change from the beginning of the game to the end, barring one or two abilities. Even characters like Robin, who are portrayed as a stealth specialist, aren't given a ton of proper tools to change the way he plays stealth, but rather it makes the usual methods easier. Things like quiet footsteps, taking longer to spot, lures which function the same way as throwing a batarang somewhere. It's all buffs to the things you already do. Contrast this with the combat that changes drastically given the gear, and we have a stealth system that quickly becomes underwhelming. Some might feel the need to stick to the shadows because the enemies are too strong, which leads me to another issue that people had with this game, the health bars and damage numbers. This is the Pavlovian response I mentioned. Gamers see damage numbers and go feral, like I don't get it. Either way, they can be turned off here, and they provide useful information when fighting freeze. I found my ranged attacks were doing more damage than the close attacks. I wouldn't have known that without the damage numbers. If I had to guess, people don't like damage numbers because it implies damage sponges, which weren't too much of an issue here. This is where difficulty comes in. Depending on your playstyle, damage sponges won't be an issue at all. Assuming you don't bother with any gear optimizing, you'll be defeating most enemies in a few hits, and boss fights will be an equal cakewalk. On normal difficulty, enemies will take a bit to go down, and boss fights will begin entering damage sponge territory, and this reaches its climax on hard. The thing is, the moment you begin to barely consider the gear you're equipping, you will mow through even the hardest difficulties. After completing my first playthrough, I decided to head into New Game Plus and properly spec my characters on hard mode, and I found the game to be so easy that I stopped playing. I was physically there, pressing buttons, but there were no thoughts. Much like cooking a beautiful recipe from HelloFresh by using code HelloBoyAqua at the checkout to get up to 20 free meals. Okay, I'll stop, I'm sorry. One of my builds was for Batgirl, and I like to call this Lazarus Babs. I'm going to run through the whole kit, but only to emphasize how broken a good build can be with just a bit of tinkering. The armor set was a legendary reinforced suit with a few mods increasing health and elemental resistance to electricity and ice. Then I had 3 passive buffs. The first was the TKO heal, which healed me after every knockout. The next was a final resolve, which increased defense when my health was low. And finally, perfect critical allowed me to do increased critical damage after a dodge. Then we have the toxic tonfa for melee. which had mods to increase elemental effect and critical hit damage. Then it had 3 buffs. The first granted momentum after a perfect knockout attack, the second gave added momentum after knocking out an enemy with a momentum ability, and the third increased elemental effect and resistance after a knockout. Finally, I had a vampiric batarang that had 3 mods increasing critical damage and passives that healed me over time when using a momentum ability, gave added elemental effects when hitting an enemy with precision aim, and granted health after landing a critical hit. It gets better. I then have multiple upgrades that increase Batgirl's critical hit chance, damage, health regeneration when defeating enemies with grab strikes, an ability that lets you revive yourself twice, and I call this build the Lazarus Babs because you do not die. In fact, there's a good chance you'll go entire encounters not using medkits. From the moment I enter, I just need to get one pick on a low-level thug, and after that, it's an unstoppable snowball effect that makes even boss fights a cakewalk. So here is where difficulty becomes hard to judge. When you can create a loadout like this, there is no challenge even on the hardest difficulties. So for those that might feel the game has damage sponges, there are plenty of solutions for that. One option is to actually engage with the gear system, and the other is to crank down the difficulty. A quick side note, I don't want to shame anyone for playing on easy. If that's what works for you, then by all means do it. And anyone who does shame someone because they aren't getting the real challenge should just mind their own business. One could argue that playing on lower difficulties could prevent you from engaging with one of the most rewarding aspects of the game, sure. But either way, play how you want. On my first playthrough, I almost changed the difficulty to easy during one of the endgame boss fights, of which there are a solid amount. Paralleling the variety in boss fights is the varying quality. Mr. Freeze in his first fight is tough, some attacks border on undodgeable, but the loop of fighting on the ground and then taking to the air as we dodge environmental hazards works well. Sadly, his health bar is rather large, which is a running theme. The atmosphere surrounding the fight is good and the weather is perfect, but your rematch against him is not a good look. Instead of fighting Freeze, we get to fight his spider-like mech. This mech, of course, has far more health and the attacks are fine enough. The only real issue with the fight is how long it takes. Even with maxed out gear and stats, I struggled to feel as though I made a dent, and it feels that this fight, like other portions of the game, were designed with co-op in mind. Harley Quinn is a melee-based close-range combatant who cycles waves of enemies through her many attack patterns. Her fight was satisfactory, and while not doing anything revolutionary, also doesn't misstep. Then there's Clayface, who might be the best boss in the game if not for one fatal issue. The fight begins at the dam, and a third of the way through, Clayface begins chasing you down the sewers, which incorporates the bat cycle into combat in a way that is only used in this instance. I was surprised to not see any chases on the bat cycle because there is an option to use ranged attacks on it, and having a high-speed chase where you need to throw batarangs to damage an enemy while also dodging the oncoming traffic would be far better than the tank sections of old, but I digress. The second phase is similar to the first, but with a few ranged attacks. The crucial error is that in many cases I was being hit when I wasn't supposed to, and a lot of attacks tracked me hard enough that I had no time to course correct. A further issue is that a lot of Clayface's attacks combo into each other, and on the hardest difficulty, that means one mistake costs a majority of your health bar, exacerbating the frustration with getting hit and stunned from something you shouldn't. Otherwise, this fight was really unique, and the changing environments halfway through kept the fight interesting. By the end of the game, you'll find out the shocking revelation that nobody saw coming: Bruce isn't actually dead, and you have a boss fight against him. I love this idea, and the fight is hard enough, but it lacks any major depth as Bruce just throws 3 or 4 hit combos that leave him exposed at the end. But this fight is in service of the characters more than the gameplay, and this is excusable because the real final boss is Talia al Ghul. Talia has 2 phases. The first is a standard fight, but relatively difficult, and her second phase is where things get interesting, because the game pulls a fast one and removes the dodge icons. Every attack in the game has a circle appear around the incoming damage, and Talia's second phase is the only time this disappears, which makes the fight much more difficult and makes me wish the game did this more. For the first time in combat, I had to pay ample attention to the enemy and what was happening on screen. I didn't simply wait for a circle to dodge. I had to assess attack patterns and telegraphs, which was refreshing. Talia telegraphs her attacks in advance, so this mix-up doesn't feel unfair, but rather a minor adjustment that makes the fight slightly harder. As the fight continues, she'll begin healing herself in the Lazarus Pit, but this can be stopped if you use a momentum ability on her. This means momentum management is important here, and this is why I like the Talia fight so much. It's a proper test of dodging, DPS, momentum management, and the culmination of the story, which is exactly what a final fight should be. When you aren't dealing with the main plot involving the Court of Owls, you'll be engaging in a wide range of side content. Some are good, and others not so much. Let's get the bad ones out of the way first. The collectibles are harmless, but I did not enjoy finding all the batarangs and street murals. Fortunately, the rewards behind them are negligible, so I wouldn't blame anyone for skipping them. One side quest that is not mentioned directly in game sees you finding different Court of Owl murals around the map. There are no waypoints or even trackers for the quest, but if you find them all, you get talent outfits for the cast, which is a great secret. Around the map, there are many servers which need to be accessed because they have data relating to Bruce Wayne's identity. Getting to these often sees you moving through security and avoiding enemies, and were enjoyable enough. The end of it sees the Bat family watching a video of Bruce Bruce Wayne dancing naked at the time of Batman's death, which is admittedly hilarious and totally something Bruce Wayne would do to cover up his identity. I enjoyed this side quest plenty, much like the secret caches. The caches I initially didn't enjoy as they offered no challenge, but then I realized their true purpose of offering gear. Each secret cache has some equipment that scales to your level, so if you're stuck and don't feel like doing side activities, you can take this 30-second detour to get some gear. This is another reason why I'd argue the game features minimal grinding, as getting good loot is seconds away at any point in the map. The worst side quest by far is the fast travel points. You might think they're difficult to mess up, just climb a large structure or even in Spider-Man's case, perform a short minigame, but somehow, Gotham Knights presents the most bland attempt at activating a fast travel point. How do you complete these? You enter a location, look for 1 to 3 drones, and scan them. Sounds lame, right? Well, it gets worse. Some of these drones have blockers, meaning that you cannot scan them until they land, which forces you to wait, and while said wait isn't long, it feels like an eternity. These were so forgettable that I indeed forgot about them. This part of the video is being recorded after the video is done, and it was only after watching it back that I realized I had forgotten the worst side quest that provided no gear, no loot, no fun, and no challenge. For a legitimate challenge, or at least a semblance of challenge, you can compete in the few races around the city, featuring the bat cycle or your traversal abilities. These were fun, and specifically in Red Hood's case, they forced me to incorporate grappling into jumping. The issue with these is that the time requirement is really easy. In my playthrough, I failed maybe 3 of these and the rest were done first try. A solution would be to have a bronze, silver, and gold rank, and offer different gear for completion. Legendary gear for gold, purple for silver, and blue for bronze. We should be able to replay these races too, allowing us to compete on leaderboards perhaps. That way we satisfy both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Otherwise, these were fun, and I hope they add more in future updates. There are a series of contacts around Gotham that will, upon you completing their requests, will grant you gear and experience. These are useful when collecting materials, and I appreciated that a majority of these goals will be completed while you do other things. There are legitimate quests here which see you taking down the likes of Mr. Freeze, Harley Quinn, and Clayface, all under a Villain of the Week structure. I say Villain of the Week because Gotham Knights makes no attempt to explore these characters, which they don't necessarily have to, but it's hard to assume that Freeze, one of the most sympathetic villains in Bruce's rogues gallery, is just freezing Gotham for fun. There are more believable instances for those like Harley Quinn, who are already insane, but even then there's no end goal. She's recruiting people, but for what? World domination, I guess? Regardless, the individual objectives are fun, and in the case of Clayface, some of the game's high points. Chasing Clayface on the bat cycle was a great set piece and the only time the game asked this of you. Once tracking him down, you have a unique fight against tens of Clayface clones, and gripes about the boss fight aside, these 2 encounters were designed well, and this applies to Harley too. Moving through the theater and Gotham General feel like levels I easily could have made the main story. Freeze's first encounter is a highlight of the game, and should have been where his quest ended. Having this kind of change to Gotham eclipses most of the events in the court story too, further exemplifying its quality. Gameplay in the main quest is a significant amount of fun and attempts different detective-esque mechanics, but they all fall short of the combat. Investigating crime scenes sees you scanning and analyzing different clues to deduce information. In the main quest line, this is handled well. You must read the clues, connect the dots both literally and figuratively, and the reward is one that makes sense. In the open world, it's literally 4 clues that mean nothing, and the 5th one gives you way more information than the others, confirming that it must be right. The main plot will see you eavesdropping, which on paper is Batman-esque, but translates to a rather boring point and click. Interrogating never ceases to please, but the puzzles here are often underwhelming and at times incredibly frustrating. The first many we'll get stuck on will be the shadow puzzle. If you listen closely, you'll hear a collective groan as I mention this one. There are 4 different pieces that project a shadow, and the goal is to, in a very on-the-nose fashion, project an owl. The issue is there are multiple acceptable answers, and the puzzle only completes when you have the right answer after a few seconds, meaning people like myself would project an image, not see any feedback after 2 seconds and think, oh, must be wrong, and then spend 10 minutes trying other options. It creates frustrations that is only amplified by Googling the answer and seeing that it is one you've already deduced. While many have criticized and praised the gameplay, many have also criticized the story, and I think these criticisms are fair. Something to note is that while the plot itself may not be great, its characters carry the otherwise shaky plot threads. The court is presented as a secret society, but is also the worst kept secret in all of Gotham. The characters are given roles that they don't entirely fit into, and many of them have side plots that don't get a resolution, which in one case works, but for the others, not so much. The plot begins with the death of Batman, and the surviving Bat family attempting to pick up the pieces. Their goal? Finish Batman's last case surrounding the murder of Kirk Langstrom and the theft of his research. This quest leads to Harley, who shows them that certain criminals are not serving the sentence that they should. And after further investigation, they discover that the age-old Court of Owls is in fact real, and without Batman, stronger than ever. They also run into Talia al Ghul at the GCPD morgue, who kills Ra's al Ghul so he can be resurrected through the Lazarus Pit. As they track down the court, they discover that their leader, the Voice, is not only a friend of Alfred, Jacob Kane, but that the court is at war with the League. Following a lead to Arkham Asylum reveals that Langstrom's research was used by the League to create man-bats, one of which attacks you, and you barely escape. Upon returning, you track down Talia al Ghul and find her in the Lazarus Pit underground. In there, we find that Bruce is not actually dead, but rather has been killed and brought back to life over and over to break his mind, and in his enraged, delirious state, he attacks the player. After defeating and appealing to him, the court shows up and decides that, voice or not, they will use the Lazarus Pit to control Gotham. While the player fights an enraged Talia, Bruce climbs to the Batwing that is hanging over the Lazarus Pit and flies into said pit, killing himself and stopping the surrounding court. But it seems Talia escapes. Whatever character you finish the game with has a new resolve towards their role and identity as Gotham's new protectors, and that's where the story ends. There are a few highlights in the story, and a few missteps too. The first of which is the very foundation of the game, Bruce. When Warner Brothers revealed that Bruce Wayne was dead, the entire internet called their bluff, and all they had to do was keep him dead. Simply put, they didn't have the balls, and instead he has to come back and tell the crew how proud he is. This is all it takes for me to believe that the game will take no risks. An alternative that doesn't undermine the game's foundation is that they can find Bruce's body, and rather than seeing he's dead, they see he still has an earpiece in which he recorded a final message. This message could be a last-minute monologue where he says that Gotham is in good hands, and that the group's journey towards becoming the city's new knights will be hard, but when they work together, they are capable of anything. Instead, he's alive for a boss fight and then sacrifices himself again to destroy the Lazarus Pit, and this alone prompts a lot of questions. First off, would Bruce want to be dead? I could see Batman wanting to die because the Lazarus Pit corrupts the user's mind, and he'd been through it multiple times. And furthermore, Bruce may respect the finality of death and not wish to prolong his existence longer than it needs to. Whatever that reason is, you can argue that it doesn't need to be explained, but what definitely does is the talents he kills on the way out. Bruce is protected in the Batwing, so if he dies from the crash, it makes sense that those on the outside would also not survive. There are talents everywhere, and there's a distinction between the regular talents and the gladiator and hunter talents. According to the emails in the game, feral talents are long dead people who have been revived and therefore don't have any brain function or consciousness, really. The gladiators and hunters, though, are brought back to life right after death, meaning they retain their consciousness. This is further supported by the hunters and gladiators being capable of forming speech and acknowledging that they are part of the court. So is Batman killing these people? Are they already dead? Is that just? This is even assuming that the actual humans of the court are capable of escaping in mere seconds, which if the run to the temple up to this point is any indicator, the cave would likely collapse before they make it out. Maybe this is a product of the pit clouding Bruce's mind, but I don't know if I enjoy Batman's send-off being a bloodbath. The final video of Bruce that plays after the credits is a far better send-off than this. But the biggest issue is still that he isn't dead. The entire internet from the moment this game was released were betting that he wasn't actually dead, and all Gotham Knights had to do to subvert expectations was keep their word, and they didn't. The other issue with Bruce is his pseudo-children. Their individual arcs are a different story, but the lack of a collective arc feels strange. When I completed the game as Barbara, she initiated a monologue about her journey and how she now feels capable of defending Gotham, independent of her teammates. This contradicted the idea that the Bat family were only so strong because they had each other. Not to say that the individuals aren't presented with unique problems, but that their resolve is entirely disconnected from the others. I had hoped that instead of the characters acting as though finishing the story solved their problems, they acknowledged their problems and accepted the help that their teammates provide. Red Hood could understand that he does not have to do this hero thing alone, and that while he might be struggling with his death and resurrection, he has a support system. Robin can understand that while he's the newest of the group, it's okay because his teammates won't let him fall. Instead, Bruce's pride is tailored to the individual player rather than being directed at the group as a whole, which is something their side arcs don't fall into. The individuals have their own problems that are completed in side quests, and they often present more interesting problems than the main plot. Jason Todd has the best side story, and it, like many of the other themes, assumes you know the Arkham story. Jason, after being killed, was brought back through the Lazarus Pit and went on his villain arc akin to his Arkham Knight appearance, but was brought back to the right side. Jason's story sees him coming to terms with his death, his life, and his guilt. He feels like an outsider among the group, and he's insecure about his temper, believing that those around him are waiting for him to snap again. Killing is the ultimate line that nobody in the Bat family wants to cross. Bruce is known to never cross that line because if he does, who knows if he'll come back. I believe Jason's determination to not only come back, but attempt to grapple with what he's been through makes him the strongest of the family. But that doesn't make him an island, and his cutscenes and emails show that he is not only going to therapy, but attempting to reconnect with his family. Some have cited scenes where the sight of death triggers a mild breakdown as predictable and ham-fisted, and perhaps the lack of a true resolution to Jason's problems leave his story unsatisfactory, but I couldn't disagree more. If Jason, after talking enough, works through his issues to the point where they leave, I'd feel it's almost disingenuous. Trauma doesn't just go away, you don't just hit a new resolve. It's a war that can't be won. But each day there's a battle, and that you can win. Getting better isn't about winning the war, it's about winning more battles than you lose. And sometimes you will lose, and that's okay. So long as you're still here, there's another chance to win tomorrow, even if a good day is only so in retrospect. And Jason knows, because his family is there, he's allowed to lose some days. It might seem stupid, but Barbara getting Jason food after he breaks down isn't a goofy means of cheering him up. It's a gesture, saying it's okay to lose. Jason's guilt is a battle he'll never finish, as it impacts his ability to move on and others' ability to do the same. His insecurities manifest in almost every interaction, and his ending is not about fixing the past, but accepting that it happened, and hoping that there's enough time to dilute the bad memories with newer, happier ones. Jason's story is the most touching for these reasons, and its subtlety strengthens this message. Barbara has a series of cutscenes regarding her father. Her problem is that she can't remember his face, and rather can only remember the statue of him. This is a concern for Babs because she has a photographic memory. Her struggle seems to be a combination of missing her late father and feeling insecure about her ability to live up to the cowl, something all the characters share. I found this story good enough for the little moments between Babs and the family, but the end of this quest sees her reminding herself that she is good enough and that her father would be proud of her. I have wondered why she didn't simply look at a photo of her father, but I could see someone arguing that isn't the point. It's rather a means for Babs to question her mental strength. Robin feels an equal amount of inadequacy while also grieving over Bruce. He's initially angry, then attempts to bargain, asking if the group can just put Bruce in the Lazarus pit, but he eventually learns to go on without him. Robin's arc is the epitome of the group learning to not be another Batman, but to do things their own way. A chess game is a metaphor used for the Knights, and through his games with Alfred, Tim realizes that while Bruce may have been their queen, there's also room for other pieces to win, and for the weakest to become the new queen. Robin takes a liking to the Rook because he believes it's an underlooked piece that moves silently while other pieces pose more urgent threats, awfully similar to how he sees himself in the group. It's one of the weaker stories in my opinion, but it's still quite good. The final arc is with Nightwing, who has insecurities living up to the role of leader. He struggles under said pressure, being the longest running sidekick and feeling the need to step up. He is reassured by his teammates, but still feels inadequate due to a prior argument with Bruce. By the end of the story, he visits Bruce's grave and finds a new resolve. I don't have any problems with this arc, except for the fact that outside of seniority, Nightwing is not the most capable leader. I believe that Barbara is a better fit, given that she seems to do the most out of the team and is the one there for everyone. When Jason is struggling, she cheers him up, and when Nightwing is the same, she takes care of him too. Otherwise, I have no problem with this arc, but it doesn't stand out to me in any meaningful way. The individual arcs and how the team learns to rely on each other makes the ending even stranger, because again, the characters act as though they won on their own. Maybe this was meant to incite multiple playthroughs, but after doing said multiple playthroughs, I can confirm that outside of gameplay, there are not enough changes to warrant resetting your progress. The biggest change is the different remarks characters have depending on what character is selected, and the reflection of the labyrinth changes, but otherwise the plot is the same, and that's okay. I don't expect them to accommodate for every character, but I did expect the villains, specifically the Court and the League, to not only be more present, but developed. The Court of Owls, despite being touted as a society so hidden that even Bruce believed it to be fake, is the worst kept secret ever. Ignoring the many owl structures around the map that directly lead to owl hideouts, their influence is easily discovered by Harley Quinn, and the Penguin under nearly no pressure decides to spill the beans. It also doesn't help that the Court's influence isn't felt over Gotham, and when they are discovered by the gang, they begin conducting their crimes in the open, wearing owl masks. I think having our team chase the League for a bit just to discover the Court would make the Court more elusive and mythical. Instead, it's just Gotham's rich and elite using their influence to control Gotham. What's worse is that when you take down the voice, Jacob Kane, the plot immediately shifts to Talia, who is a more interesting villain, but she makes the Court feel like a stepping stone and not the ultimate goal. What's worse is that the Court shows up at the end without the voice, making the villain a mere footnote in the history of the League, instead of being a proper threat. The Court ends up feeling underwhelming, and what's worse is that the Court has little connection with Batman's death. The League should be the one sidelined by the Court, not the other way around. On the bright side, Talia always steals the show when she's on screen thanks to her voice actor, though she isn't given enough depth to make an impact. The worst of this is that by the end, the Court is still around, and so is Talia and the League. The only character that is given a definitive conclusion is Bruce. The Bat family has a final resolve about protecting Gotham, and that's great, but that's where the story lies. Everything interesting that happens is with the characters and not with what those characters are doing. Harley Quinn in the story just sits in a cell and gives you a book, but her dialogue is so unique that while playing, I didn't really notice.
Now, how will I get this to you? Wait. I know.
Despite saying this what feels like 100 times so far, the basis for a great story is here, but there's not enough meat on the bones and ideas aren't fleshed out enough to make an impact outside of the characters' individual struggles. I can at least appreciate the little details and Easter eggs hidden across the story. The game begins at Batman's grave, and the entrance to the Lazarus Pit is located at the Wayne Crypt, directly behind his grave. His grave was literally pointing to his place of torture the entire time. There are also plenty of Easter eggs and references to other villains around the game, but when you look closely to notice these details, you also notice some others. The first and most glaring is how did nobody look for Bruce's body? They found it at the Batcave, and either two things happened. The crew did not keep track of the body and the casket was empty when he was buried, which is just insane incompetence, or Talia dug up the grave, took the body, and nobody noticed. This is a bit of a nitpick, but I feel like if I'm gonna note the finer details and praise, I may as well do the same the other way around. The story is portrayed as a great mystery, but ultimately feels like a run-of-the-mill episode of a TV show. And that's not even mentioning some of the objectives, like when Man-Bat is introduced. You have a boss fight against him, then you're tasked with defeating 3 of them in the open world, and then another in the underground directly after. Meaning within 45 minutes, you are fighting this boss 5 times over. Moments like these exacerbate the story's weak points, but overall I'd say there's enough highs in the side moments to leave me feeling the plot is simply satisfactory. When the credits do roll, you enter what many games of the action RPG genre provide, the endgame. The endgame here is so different from the rest of Gotham Knights that I'd agree with the idea that it is a different game altogether. New skills are asked of you, and your engagement in its mechanics will be paramount to your success. It is a grind, and while that word has a negative connotation to it, I don't believe, especially in an endgame context, that grinding is an inherently bad thing. But when that grind is poorly executed and its rewards uninteresting, you are left with an endgame grind that only supports the intrinsically motivated. I understand, calling the endgame a separate game is hyperbolic. But the point that I want to illustrate with that statement is that the gameplay loop and the reasons for engaging with said loop is so different from everything up to this point, a majority even taking place within a separate location, that it feels like a separate experience. But once again, as I write these words, patches have been released to alleviate these concerns, and so again, I'm left with evidence proving that while the launch of Gotham Knights was weak, efforts are being made to fix it, and patches are moving quickly. In the same patch that fixes my problems with the new game mode Heroic Assault, the performance improves yet again. So let's walk through the process of entering the endgame and what that gameplay loop looks like. It likely begins with you finishing the main quests and most of the side quests, leaving you at the level 30 cap. This can be raised to level 40 if you play on New Game Plus, which means you'll likely run through the game again with characters you didn't use as much on your first playthrough. Once at the end of that, you'll easily be capped out and ready to begin farming open world crimes to acquire legendary blueprints. It's here that you'll reach the first roadblock with materials, and that you require a material called Nth Material to craft the most legendary sets. This legendary material can be acquired by farming tasks for the Penguin, which ask you to complete high-level challenges, or by taking down Gotham's most wanted, specialized enemies that have a chance of popping up on the hardest crimes. When tackling premeditated crimes, you earn enough clues per thug you take down to continue farming them every night, which is appreciated. Once you've racked up enough gear and feel confident, you can take on the Heroic Assault. Heroic Assault was marketed as an endgame challenge for only the best of players, and the antagonist this time around is none other than Starro, who many were introduced to thanks to the most recent Suicide Squad film. I had high hopes for this free content update because I felt Gotham Knights otherwise lacked a solid endgame, but this seems to be the perfect solution. There are lots of positives here, such as high-level gear being best acquired here. Despite the level 40 cap, you can equip items up to level 60, and these can only be found at the depths of the Heroic Assault. This makes Heroic Assault great for farming, but an immediate downside is that this is the only place to farm. Heroic Assault is a series of floors that contain different challenges for you to tackle, with each floor being inhabited by a different faction or gang. It can be completed with up to 3 other players and can be pretty chaotic, but there is one major flaw: variety. I'd mentioned before that enemy variety was an issue, and the only outliers are the Court, whose variety seems to annoy more than anything, and the League, which doesn't show up until the latest floors. But this is just the beginning. A further issue is that there is only a small handful of unique floors in the game. Here is floor 3, and floor 15, and floor 18. Notice the difference? Didn't think you would. It's the same layout. There are 3 levels here, and they rotate between floors, meaning you'll be seeing the same environments over and over again. Outside of gameplay implications, aesthetically, the team decided to repeat what is easily the most boring environment for the game to take place. It's simply a cave, with a slight hint of Gothic architecture, but to see this repeated over and over is nothing less than disappointing. Batman's crime fighting has never been better when cloaked in the shadows cast from Gotham's neon skyline, and part of what made the main story so engaging was the different locales. Prisons, penthouses, parts of the city covered in ice, and the caves in the final chapter offered some variety in their architecture, and the Lazarus pits. But here, it is absolutely nothing. Even the final encounter, which I won't even show on screen yet for reasons that will become very apparent soon, are a colossal disappointment. But I understand the bread and butter is the gameplay, so let's continue looking there. The gameplay is the same loop over and over again, with the only changes in play coming from your playstyle, which is only influenced by preference and the gear you have. There are different objectives, but they all boil down to the same thing: combat. Fight enemies, protect a hack, and fight fight enemies in a radius, protect a payload, press a few buttons guarded by enemies. You get the idea. Variation can come from cooperative play, which I will admit made the game much more fun. And the co-op takedowns are especially well done, but otherwise it felt in many ways that I was just suffering with someone at the same time. Loot is different for each player, but the places you find them are not. Every floor in between each room has an area where there are chests to grab. These layouts, locations of the chests, and traps, a word I use very lightly here, are the same 3 layouts once again reused. Why don't we talk about objective variety? And don't worry, this will be a short one. Every 4 levels there is a reckoning, and when I saw this, I, and likely you, thought, alright, we're getting somewhere. No, don't get excited. These reckonings are the worst this endgame has to offer. The first kind of reckoning sees you defeating a few mini-bosses called faction leaders, which means they have a larger health bar and sport a star on their face. They attack the same way, but there is a special attack where they can shoot you with a beam coming from said star on their face, but this attack was so rare that I only saw it once and I wasn't recording it. It isn't special, but the other reckoning sees you pushing a payload as an onslaught of enemies swarm you. There isn't much else to it, but I did find the overwhelming amount of enemies and amount of times I had to reset the payload was infuriating, not because of true difficulty, but because there are many times where attacks overlap, causing a multiple second long stun lock. The worst part of this is that such repetition exposes the gameplay flaws. Things like quick-fire ranged attacks and stealth at times break entirely during gameplay. Stealth will sometimes see you attempt to press the triangle button to perform a takedown, but for some reason you will do a ranged attack instead, which alerts all the guards and ruins any stealth runs. Another issue is that the aiming when using a ranged attack is incredibly inconsistent. When you press triangle, you'll fire a ranged attack in whatever direction you are pushing the left stick towards. A persistent problem is that you will shoot at the unintended target. For example, a barrel instead of the enemy in front of you. I would love to get on my skill soapbox and say I'm just bad at the game, but the barrel in question wasn't even in reach, meaning I was just locked onto a target I couldn't hit. I'd be lying if I said this occurred more than 1% of the time, but the point is that when you are engaging with just mechanics, being starved of any visual flair or environmental variety, the flaws become all the more noticeable and inexcusable. But of course, this is not the lowest we go, and you might mistake Gotham Knights for playing Limbo here because its 30th floor is the biggest upset in the entire game. The whole heroic assault has been taunting you with the challenge of Starro. I didn't know what to expect, but it could not have been what we got. Okay, enough beating around the bush. The final fight against Starro is actually another payload that you escort to a station, which then has 5 buttons for you to press, but before you press the final button, you have to defeat a man-bat. I wish I was making this up, but Starro is in a jar for the entirety of the encounter. I just don't get it, man. Not only is Starro in a jar, but our final challenge at the end of over 12 hours is a boss fight we've already seen 5 times in the main story, and with no new mix-ups at that. I understand the gear makes heroic assault worth it, but when your end goal is this disappointing, I just feel like I wasted my time. Another problem with the heroic assault is that if you wanted to achieve endgame builds with gear and enemies up to level 60, you had to use the heroic assault, but that has since been patched, and the enemies in the open world will now fully scale to your level, which is appreciated. You achieve these builds to take on boss fights in another new addition, the showdowns. Showdowns are remixes of fights you have already completed against enemies that now have a fixed power level. The changes to the fights are primarily elemental, along with some new attacks that make fights generally harder. The benefit to completing them is that you get specialized gear for all characters and a few colorways, on top of some random loot. Statistics like time to kill, damage done, and times you've been down are tracked, meaning you can keep shooting for a better time. These fights can be tackled in co-op, but you might end up like me where your partner is playing like he's just happy to be there. Bro's really shooting for the participation medal, man, I swear. Anyways, most of these can be completed solo, but some bosses, specifically both fights against Freeze, are pure endurance runs as his health bar is way too large no matter the power level. I found the pre-fight to be an interesting challenge too. Before heading in, the game tells you the recommended power level, which can be ignored as I was able to take down Talia, whose recommended level is 20,000 when I was at 10,000, but this was because I spec'd my build properly and chose gear that resisted her elemental effects. Having cryo resistance against the likes of Freeze will be pertinent to your success, but I do wish there was a showdown against Bruce as he's the only one missing. I'd say this is the start to a proper endgame, but the lack of a proper final challenge leaves it underwhelming, especially when Starro could have filled that void. Overall, the endgame, for being the only time you have to extensively grind, is fine enough. But more problems occur when finding players is going to get more difficult as the days go by, which is a product of the game's commercial and critical failure. Gotham Knights suffered for many reasons, some of them entirely unearned and untrue, but the largest factor has to have been its launch. While as of writing this, around a month after release, it is significantly better, it doesn't change that the day one buyers, myself included, were burned. This kind of release should not be accepted in any way, and my defense of parts of this game are not in attempts to excuse an undoubtedly botched release, but are in the name of fairness. Things like the performance should be criticized heavily, and the lack of endgame content or the absolute crapshoot that Starro is fine to dislike, but claims of the game being full of damage sponges showcases player incompetency and stubbornness to anyone who has actually played the game. My tinfoil hat theory is that when the game was showcased initially, people saw the damage numbers, health bars, and gear, and immediately made assumptions about the game. When the game arrived, they already had a sour taste in their mouth due to the performance, and decided to not engage with the gear mechanics. This led to people being underleveled and not doing enough damage, and them thinking it's the game's fault because they don't want to actually play the game or lower the difficulty. One YouTuber, who I won't name because I don't want to send any hate their way, criticized Gotham Knights for having bullet sponges, but they, on the hardest boss in the game, were doing 900 damage per shot on Red Hood and attempting it solo, when it was clear that these challenges were made for co-op. For reference, when I attempted the same fight at half the recommended power level, I was dealing 10 to 30,000 damage per shot as Red Hood. That would be like if I went into Borderlands 2, tried to solo Terramorphous with gray weapons, ignoring slag, and not attempting to engage with the gear or skills available to me, and then complained about bullet sponges. Anyone who plays the game knows, simply put, it's a skill issue. A lot of YouTubers, some of which I know personally, have engaged in this hyperbole, and I don't think you're an asshole if you made a video complaining about damage sponges or saying that the combat has no depth. You're entitled to that opinion. I'm simply stating the effect it has on the game and those consuming it. Playing Gotham Knights after watching the many reviews is a self-fulfilling prophecy of thinking the game will be awful, playing the game improperly, and then confirming that the game is bad due to issues that could easily be solved. If you don't like damage numbers, turn them off. If you think the combat is too hard, turn it down or get better gear. A secret cache, crime, side quest is always within reach and rewards ample high-level gear for you. All of this is on the assumption that you actually bought the game too. Many just parroted the criticisms from their favorite YouTuber, which is not said YouTuber's fault. You guys probably do the same with my videos, even though I have a total of 2 brain cells on a good day. But the final nail in the coffin with Gotham Knights is simply the success of the Arkham quadrilogy. A new Batman game can never escape the comparisons to the Arkham series, and especially in the case of Gotham Knights, the comparisons are ones they don't often win. Yes, Gotham Knights looks good, but Arkham Knight looks better. Yes, the combat here is good, but Arkham's was in many ways better. The gliding was better, stories were better, the level design was better. Are all these things good in Gotham Knights? Yes, but Arkham did it better. I would agree that when critically looking at a game, I should and did disconnect it from the Arkham games, but I can't hold the average consumer to that same standard. The only real leg up this game has over Arkham is in its combat variety, character variety, and vehicles, as the Batcycle doesn't have a tank function, so we can rejoice in that. I think Gotham Knights failed for all these reasons, but it shouldn't be ignored that the developers are listening. In writing this script, there were tons of criticisms I had discussed that got patched, and others I've mentioned will surely be fixed even further. The game runs far better now, less bugs and overall jank. If you were on the fence for this game, I'd say in its current state it is worth the money. It's a good game, and at the moment runs fine. I know many are still hoping for a performance mode, but I don't think that's on the table. And if you care about frame rates that much, you'd be better off swapping to PC anyways. Regardless of the patches the game gets, Gotham Knights will never leave the shadow of its predecessor. Its story falls short in many ways, and while its gameplay and characters do excellent, taking down the colossal Arkham series is a nigh impossible task. And that's okay. I think it's easy when the bar for the Arkham series is so high to call anything that isn't a 9 out of 10 a 5. But Gotham Knights has my respect for still delivering a competent product, even if that product arrived a month after its initial release. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video, I appreciate it. I apologize that this took so long to come out. Between you and me, I was in a bit of a slump while making this video. I just felt like, I think it was just because I had Christmas right around the corner, and then I had finals at the same time, and I just had like no time, and when I did have time, it was like, oh, I was so tired. So now that I've gotten it done though, I feel like I'm kind of back into the swing of things. I took a good like week and a half, almost 2 weeks off in December, so feeling a lot more well rested. And yeah, so sorry it took a while to come out, but I hope it was worth it. I put a lot of passion into this video, and it was really fun to talk about Batman again. And truthfully, I enjoy this game a lot more than I thought I would, which is very good because I was anticipating this game quite a bit, and I was really excited for its release. This will be the first video of 2023, in which case I want to say Happy New Year and Happy Holidays. I hope you guys got good gifts and stuff, and I hope you had some good celebrations. As far as the new year for me, it's going to be much the same. I'm going to try and expand into more Spider-Man games this year. I really love Spider-Man, even more than Batman, actually. Don't tell anyone. But for some reason, I just don't really talk about the Spider-Man games. Maybe it's because the Arkham games are, in my eyes, like the gold standard for superhero games, and they're like obviously where my passion is. So expect some more Spider-Man games. Expect me to finish up the Assassin's Creed series, the Uncharted series, and the Tomb Raider series this this year. And then I've also started posting occasionally on TikTok. I've been doing 60-second reviews over there. And so if I remember, I will link that in the description. I just figured it'd be like a fun side thing to do. And, you know, hopefully it could drive some more traffic to the main channel. And I just want to thank you guys for a good 2022. The channel did really well that year, and I couldn't be more grateful. And I think I say thank you so much that it becomes diluted. Like, it means nothing because I say it all the time, but you guys really have changed my life, and I could not be more grateful for that. So thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting me. Thank you for giving me feedback and helping me improve. And I hope I can continue to improve. With that said, I hope you guys have a fantastic 2023. I love you guys. Take care of each other. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Oh, you should follow my Twitter too. Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, bye-bye.